All too often, today, we take for granted things that happened in history. And simply because history happened in a continuum and it ended up with a certain result doesn't mean that it was really preordained that way. That there's a lot of things in history that could have gone a different way very easily. And one of these was Omaha Beach.
We were supposed to land with ideal weather conditions, and that is not what happened on D-Day. And the price was that the floating Sherman tanks, many of them sank, creating the circumstance that first wave assault forces were on the beach and they had no armor support. Some of the men that were landing on Omaha Beach were a part of a JASCO, a Joint Assault Signal Company, meaning that some of the troops that were going ashore, even in the first wave, were naval shore fire control parties that were to call by radio out to the fleet offshore and call in accurate artillery fire to support the movement of troops from the beachhead into the interior. Well, the high tides that were whipped up by the strong winds that were attending the generally bad weather that weekend, they created circumstances where the radios got soaking wet and the radios couldn't work, and so the naval shore fire control parties could not communicate with the ships offshore. And this is why American casualties on Omaha Beach were astonishingly high. To this day, we still don't know the exact number of Americans killed on Omaha Beach during the battle, but we do know that it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 men. The United States sacrificed 1,000 men for the establishment of that beachhead.
So the Americans in small groups, led by small unit leaders, eventually worked their way up to the tops of the bluffs. And as they would work their way up to the top, they would start fanning out, trying to clear the Germans that were killing their comrades down on the beaches. By the end of the day, Omaha Beach, which was a near-run thing, if it weren't for individual bravery, it would have been more of a massacre, but also the Germans would have pushed the American troops right back into the English Channel.
This is where the first Americans to get off of Omaha Beach reached the top of the bluff. This is the WN-60 bunker complex looking down on Omaha Beach in the Fox sector, the far eastern sector of Omaha. And it was in front of this bunker complex where those Americans fought an intense battle with German defenders. The group of Americans landed on Fox sector Omaha, had to clear a minefield. With tank support, they moved up the draw that's just behind me called the F1 draw, the Cabourg draw. And when they reached the top of the Cabourg draw, they went into action against this formidable position, and it is indeed formidable. Because in it, you have Tobruk positions for mortars, the two behind me, and those mortars were perfectly situated with this commanding and spectacular view looking down on Omaha Beach. There were also infantry fighting positions for Tobruks that mounted machine guns, and then the entire complex was connected by this series of zigzag trenches, the vestiges of which can still be seen here today. When the men of the 16th Infantry Regiment reached the top of the Cabourg draw and they went into action against WN-60, they were being led by a second lieutenant named Jimmy Monteith. Lieutenant Monteith was directing the men in action against this position when a German counterattack isolated them, cut off. Lieutenant Monteith was attempting to lead the fight out of that predicament when a German gunshot struck him and ended his life. In the aftermath of D-Day, Lieutenant Monteith is recognized for leading this action, for leading his men all the way through the obstacles, the minefield, up the Cabourg draw, and then in the attack here on WN-60. He's recognized for incredible, exceptional leadership, and he is posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He is one of 3 recipients of the Medal of Honor who remain buried today at the Normandy American Cemetery. And he is one of 9,386 other Americans who came to France during the summer of 1944 to advance the cause of liberation and who have never left. They've been here ever since, and Lieutenant Monteith remains in that cemetery to this day, 75 years later. Two days after the invasion began, The 3rd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, was advancing from the area around Pointe du Hoc, just over there, toward the town behind me called Grand Comp. The battalion moved down into this ravine where there's a river that goes through, and they were taking up positions here, waiting to begin their final assault on the town, when they were greeted by machine gun fire and mortar fire from the hilltop behind me. The battalion was waiting here for tank support, being swept by machine gun and mortar fire, when one of the men from K Company had enough. His name was Frank D. Perigori. Without being ordered to do so, Perigori rose to his feet, ran up the 200 meters of exposed terrain toward the enemy trenches on top of the hill. When he jumped down into those trenches, he met a German squad, killed 8 of them right away with his M1 rifle. He then bayoneted 3 additional men. The rest of the squad then surrendered to Perigori. He sent them down the hill toward the American lines. And then Perigori continued down the trench line. He met another larger group of Germans, brought them under rifle fire, and then, to his surprise, 32 men emerged and surrendered to this one American soldier. When Perigori then led that group of 32 prisoners down this hill back toward the K Company lines, it was then that the battalion commander realized that the entire battalion objective, an objective that was to be seized by 500 men, well, that battalion objective had just been seized by one man carrying out an individual, a solitary military action. And for this action, Perigori was ultimately awarded the Medal of Honor. But sadly, he never had a chance to wear that Medal of Honor, because just a few days later, on June 14, 1944, Frank Perigori was killed in action fighting in the hedgerows.
The British and Americans moved off the beaches. They hit obstacles. For the Americans, it was the bocage, the hedgerows. Now, Allied planners had looked at the aerial photographs, and they had trained the troops to assault the beach, but they had not trained the men to fight in hedgerows. The Germans had had years to create defensive positions within these hedgerows, and they fought tenaciously. Every little field was its own private battlefield.
The American vision of what combat was supposed to be, which was a vision of fluidity on the battlefield, moving rapidly from place to place. All of that is stripped away by the hedgerow enclosed environment. It slowed us down so much and then bogged us down at Martinville Ridge, right outside of St. Lo, to the extent that we had to come up with a plan. Some plan to break through the intense German defenses around St. Lo. And so the plan that we came up with was an operation that would be called Cobra. And Operation Cobra was going to, first of all, carry out a massive carpet bombing sweep in a box 1 mile deep, 5 miles wide, that was just to the west of the city of St. Lo, opening then up a gap that would allow our mechanized forces, particularly the forces of the 2nd Armored Division, to flow through and to quickly achieve what we had not yet achieved, which was rapid mobility.
The Operation Cobra Breakout ultimately brought the U.S. 2nd Armored Division here to Notre-Dame-Saulnier. In fact, the 67th Armored Regiment, it wheeled through the center of the village. At the head of the column was Lieutenant Colonel Richard E. Nelson. And Nelson pulled his M5A1 Stuart light tank right up to this spot. Right when the vehicle came to a halt, German paratroopers poured out of the church behind me and onto these stairs. That's when Nelson swung the barrel of the M2 HB-50 caliber machine gun mounted on top of his Stuart in this direction and opened fire. In a grisly scene that's captured later in a famous photograph, many German paratroopers are killed by Lieutenant Colonel Nelson on these stairs, and the stairs to this very day still bear the scars from that battle 75 years ago. Nelson himself would be killed in action immediately after this, and he is buried today at the Normandy American Cemetery.
When we think of D-Day, we tend to only think of June 6, 1944. And that overlooks the overall campaign. And during that campaign, Allied fighting forces paid dearly. In addition to that, the Norman people pay a high price. It's believed now that over 25,000 Normans were killed during the Normandy campaign. Collateral damage in a battle that they had not wanted, but a battle that ravaged their homeland nevertheless. And to this day, they rarely mention those casualties. And I think they're like that because they don't want to make us feel uncomfortable about it. Because to them, They recognize it as the cost of freedom.